I've had a note to myself about the law of least action in the mix of things for a while. And I first heard about that in a talk by Peter Russell, not Russell Peters, but Peter Russell, who I believe is some kind of physicist, and he studies consciousness. And his talk called The Primacy of Consciousness, which you can watch on sprword.com, is really good. And he talks about the law of least action. And I don't remember what that is exactly, but I just saw now that in an extrapolation to mental health, it seems like the law of least action has something to do with ending one's life. So it takes the least amount of action to just end one's life and to not have to act ever again, not have to do anything ever again, and to take the fastest action, the least action to end this suffering. And so I feel like getting caught in that program to end one's life sometimes is a law of least action. And how can one not be caught in those memes that makes one feel like one needs to act that out and end this existence? And could there be another least action, which is when one can perceive something and understand it and create more information and energy, so much more energy, to the powers of 10 more energy. When one can really perceive and understand something, consciousness can access. So one then has a lot of energy, and so one can do a lot with that energy. So then one wouldn't fall into that vortex of the law of least action of consciousness, which might end the conscious existence of a particular organism. And I don't know if that makes any sense or if it matters, but I just saw that now. I feel like I should stop talking, but I'm going to keep going for a while. Maybe I'll just read. Work is force times mass times distance. The force is the energy of thought, or the energy of the infinity of the moment. The force of the moment. The moment, it's when we meet the moment and say, instead of having an immediate answer of words intersecting the moment. It feels like bipolar when the process is still being processed by the ego, or within the ego framework of right, wrong, good, bad, reward, punishment, and the past. When we disidentify from that, it becomes a choiceless richness. We're overlaying the choice of good and bad over it. The right values can emerge instead of what our conditioned programs call right and wrong. All this takes attention. If we aren't attending, the ego will classify it with its binary code. Choicelessness is a quantum code that decodes the unknown possibilities. And it's really about seeing the subtle. Words make things manifest. They make things things. But if we don't have those words interrupting things, then energy can speak to us and speak through us. And our perception of an energetic field will create the words in us to speak. And I wonder if the brain spaceship is trying to change. So can it go from the ego ship to the we-go ship? If new structures evolved in the past, maybe new structures are trying to evolve now. I am the situation. We situate each other when our energies meet, and we might think, I don't like how a certain person situates us. I don't like how that person situates my experience. And I don't like how the mental health system situates my experience. When thought is going on, it creates the impression that there is a tension, that the one attending to it is the ego. This is a mirage. Thought creates the ego by dividing itself into thinker and thought. So it creates a mirage of the attender, of something attending to thought. But it's really thought undergoing some kind of fission reaction. It's splitting. It's splitting the structure of thought, which is just language, into subject and object. And it's interesting that we speak in terms of subject and object. So I think there's something in the way that we actually speak that creates this feeling of division. And it's this thought fission that's separating thought into thinker and thought. And the thinker is sort of appearing as attending to the thought, but it's really just that thought split into subject and object. And a thought is usually in the frame of subject and object because that's how we speak. So it's like this language has taken us over, but it's because we're not perceiving in the moment and speaking as the moment, which creates a different language that isn't divided into subject and object. The trouble is, though, when interacting with beings that see things in this way, there's still this energy that wants to remove itself from that situation, and that can seem like I don't like this situation, but it's like Gaia moving away from these false structures and moving more towards something that is more life-affirming. It's not a matter of figuring out what a beautiful life looks like, but the way life is looked at as beauty. So if we are as beauty, how we look at life is a beautiful life. Can we look from beauty as beauty? And I feel like there's a domain of meaning beyond right and wrong. It's wondering. So I feel like there's actually a wanderer there. When we're in the state of wondering, that other energy speaks to us and speaks through us. And it's beyond right and wrong because that is in the domain of programs. Good is different than right and wrong, and good isn't a program. So I can see it's really important to abide in the wanderer and asking questions, and not even actually overtly asking questions or asking questions within oneself, but just having a brain that is in the state of questioning, of inquiring, without actually asking a question. And I wonder if the prefrontal cortex wants to transform into the magic cortex. And the me is just a notion, and the notion of Gaia has other ideas. And it's something other than the me giving us our ideas. The me can only reorganize past stuff stored up in the brain. But when we can see, we can get other ideas from something other than the me, from infinity. And walking needs no skill, but if we want to learn gymnastics, we have to put a lot of energy and attention there. And map consciousness is like learning gymnastics without having a choice. It's like having to walk a tightrope for the first time and master it on the first try. And it's a new way to move in consciousness. And the interesting thing is when we have access to perception and insight, that gives us energy, and it gives us the energy to learn how to walk in that consciousness. It is the energy of that other consciousness. And as we move in that, our bodies become attuned to moving with that consciousness. So if we get a glimpse of that energy and we keep glimpsing it moment to moment, we're able to stay in that energy and be fueled by that. And the brain is running on the fuel of perception and energy and action instead of thought and habit, which requires very little energy. It doesn't create any energy to do any more work, to do any more action. So I see that perception is how the brain actually creates energy. And it creates energy to change itself and transform itself and create new structures that it might need to move in this new field. And it might actually create a structure that can dematerialize the body and keep it minimally together and then rematerialize it as necessary. And the interesting thing is that this structure in the brain would be invisible when we're in our material form. And I remember talking about a book where they talk about how perception being biased and inaccurate is actually adaptive. Well, it's adaptive for the me, and it's adaptive for saving energy by operating based on habits and just doing the same thing over and over again. But there's no creation in that, and there can't be because there's no energy to create anything else, because we haven't seen anything else to have the energy to even have an insight into what else we could create, which could be as simple as a different gesture or a small action. And MAP is a recalibration of these inaccuracies to perceive with Gaia and move with Gaia, which takes a lot of energy, but perceiving with Gaia gives us the understanding which creates that energy and allows us to move in that energy. So the energy, the perception creates the energy, which creates the brain, which creates the gestures, which helps us to continue to move in that field. And they talk about these perceptual biases being adaptive for the me. It keeps us separate individuals, but right now Gaia actually needs accurate perceptions in order to preserve Gaia. So I think there's this shift moving towards actually perceiving Gaia, because that's what the whole cosmos needs, the whole earth. And I wonder if it's an anabolic process in the brain, this perception and insight and energy and action. And it's actually anabolism of a new world, not just well, it's actually, that world is already there. It's allowing the brain to create the structures to be able to perceive it and move in it, which could just be as simple as changing a lifestyle to include more nature, or more extreme things for some people. And I feel like actually the perception and understanding of nature helps to allow nature to grow, in that if we understand it, we're not going to bother it, or we're going to steward it, or even just the perception of it. It might actually have some understanding that we're seeing it and perceiving it and listening to it just by looking at it, because it doesn't talk, but we can listen to nature by looking at it and then understanding it, and it will tell us to stay away or to do something or what to do. And that's what Gaia needs right now. And I was thinking about how the movement of a fetus isn't necessarily coherent. They're not walking, they're not doing anything, but it actually makes for later coherence. So some of these things that we experience in map consciousness might actually not seem very coherent, but they might actually be sort of like movements of the fetus, actions that actually lead to greater coherence later. And I see map in this way, but it's never explored in this way. It's never explored sort of like this fetal state in a way. It's like we become fetuses to be born into connection with Gaia, real communion with Gaia. And in that womb, we're sort of thrashing around and not really knowing what we're doing, but it's actually preparing us to walk in that world of Gaia. And drugging us in this state is like paralyzing a fetus from the neck down and never allowing for those chaotic movements that later provide for its ability to walk coherently when it is born from the medium of the womb to the medium of the world. And if it gets paralyzed from the neck down, it's not going to actually be able to kick, and it won't grow straight bones. So if we're not able to do this process of sort of kicking and screaming and thrashing through that, then we're not actually growing the right structures in the brain and in our body and in our muscles and our energy in order to be able to walk in that world. And it's keeping us paralyzed and in this world of the collective that at some point is going to implode upon itself. And I was thinking about somebody who gave a talk and said 75% of fetuses, I guess, die within 8 weeks of conception. So they're edited out. 75% die within 8 weeks of conception. And so they were talking about it in evolutionary terms, like a lot of those things are edited out. And I wonder if those things aren't needed, or there's just a lot of things that can go wrong when it's first developing and it doesn't work. So only a quarter make it past 8 weeks. And then there's still a lot of things that can go wrong after that. But I was thinking about how children who end up on the autism spectrum, they don't get edited out. They make it past the 8 weeks. They make it to life. They make it to 2 years a lot of times before we even know that anything is wrong. So to me, it feels like it has some kind of evolutionary significance in some way. And maybe it's not even genetic because it's not being edited out as genetically bad. Maybe it is mimetically good, or it's going to make us really look at consciousness and the self and what it all really means. And can we really love and care for these innocent children? And also, the egg portion of the children that are being born now was actually present when that child's mother was born. So, say 20, 30 years ago. So this epidemic that's happening actually had the potentiality in the genetics of the mom, if it is anything to do with the maternal line, because the mom was already born 20 or 30 years ago before the baby was born. So that being said, it could be something, if it is genetic, to actually do with the male sperm, because that is more of a now thing. Men don't have all their sperm when they're born, but women have all their eggs. So it's something to do with sperm, which could be said something to do with masculine energy. When you look up masculine energy, you look at masculine traits, and these are all the traits that are augmented in the ego. So symbolically, I still feel like it has something a lot to do with the ego and words and how language is used, and subject-object verbs and subject-object formation of sentences, which children with autism have trouble with. All these structures of languages, which are the structure of language that is destroying us as a humanity. So there's something there. It's like there's some kind of signal in maybe the sperm that's signaling it's time to change the way we experience the self, and change the way we use language, and change the way we acquire language, and change what meanings mean and how we see what meanings mean. And I feel these sensitive children can see the meanings of society as they're growing up, and then something is triggered that they can't participate with that because we just can't do this anymore. We can't see ourselves as separate. And how will we do that when the words we're using perpetuates this separation? Well, we can create children that can't pick up words the same way. It's really messed up, but yeah, I don't know. So I feel like there's some kind of perception and language theory of autism more to do with the morphic field and the morphomimetic field and epigenetics and epigesturetics. And as we have more loving gestures towards these children and allow them to really move in a different field of reality, maybe we'll be able to meet them again and be able to communicate. But we have just as much to learn from them and the way their brains are operating as we're trying to make them learn from us. And I'm not an expert on this stuff. It's just, I feel like I'm just a human brain talking. I'm just a human brain seeing the brain and talking about the brain. I have a brain, and the brain can see, and the brain can communicate with itself and other brains, and I don't know, I just feel like I have this sense that I'm seeing and saying things that I have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's maybe just a cry out of the human brain to really connect with this other dimension. And I feel like if we can connect with it as people who go through the mental health system, that will, and translate that energy and bring that energy in and be in touch with that process of perception and creating energy and information, that information will actually trickle down and take some of the pressure off these young children to be the brains that don't acquire language, because the language they would acquire is actually quite destructive. And so I feel like if we can transcend through this and translate it and pass that energy along, it could actually reduce the need for Gaia to produce children that can't acquire language, and Can we change the language that they might acquire so they can sense that that's out there, so they can feel safe to actually still develop in a way to communicate with parents? And I have a few more points, and my buttocks is really hurting from this chair, but we'll see if I can get through it. Behind the meaning-making process is seeing in the moment. And this is not in logical order, it's in dialogical order. It's in the order of dialogue. Dialogue with Gaia, with oneself, which is all the same thing. And we need dialogical chaos and disorder in order for a new order to arise. We have to be willing to be vulnerable with our language and our creations of meaning, and not just and are creating meaning and not just ascribing to the meanings and beliefs of society. That's not a creative process, that's a conforming process. Yet we're all afraid of each other, yet we all want to be creative in different ways. And being creative implies stepping out of conformity, at least within oneself, conforming to a pattern. And to me it seems like we have dialogical disorders, and all these problems are really problems of dialogue. We split everything into subject, object, and separate ourselves, and we're not really in direct contact and giving voice to something, some energy. So really, dialogical disorders are just not having yet learned dialogue in communion with the moment, and it's not necessarily a mental illness. It's just a dialogical disorder. And I feel like map consciousness is what happens when we have a problem with society and what happened to us. We have a problem with what society makes us do to ourselves and others. And we have a problem with what society does to other people. And really there is no division between society and people. It's all within. But we want to change our internal society to create a different society. And maybe first we can do that by having dialogue with ourselves to change our own internal society and how we communicate with ourselves, and then move that to how we communicate with other people. If we can't communicate with ourselves, how can we communicate with other people? And it starts to feel like the universe and Gaia is my body, and we start expanding the maps in our brain of what we consider to be ourselves. And I think that's what happens in map consciousness. There's this expansion of what we consider to be ourselves. And so our brain can really understand so much more, and it's so much more information, but it's trying to give us that information, even if it's just temporary, to have that lightly mapped in the brain so we can act more adequately even when we're no longer in that state. So it's expanding the body map and what is mine. And really it's all mine. This whole experience of me sitting here, this is only my experience, and all of it is my responsibility, from the smallest energy in my body expanding all the way outward. It's all implied in each other. And if it's all implied in each other, if we change the smallest energy in our body, that's going to change everything outward. And the outward is what we all share. It's our shared body. And if we can change that, then we all start acting just a little bit differently, and then something else gets created. And I feel like we're growing beyond storytellers. The stories disappear in Alzheimer's. But a lot of times, meaning and context can bring it out. So I feel like meaning is deeper in our brain, and if we can fill our brain with meaning instead of stories and thoughts, then perhaps it is more neuroprotective, in that it's creative and it's always creating neurons instead of wearing out patterns and constellations of neurons. What if neurons can be so creative that they're created just for a single perception and then they die because they're making room for new brain cells for the next perception? So the brain can respond to meaning a lot longer. And I was thinking about MAP as autonoetic consciousness. It allows us to examine our ego structure. It allows us to step back from identifying with the ego and actually identify with attention and the container rather than the content. And so it allows us to see the content. So I feel like it's really meant to be a hyper learning experience and really learn about the structures a lot faster than if we were actually identified with the structures. And learn as much as we can before we merge with it again. And when we're more identified with some of these patterns of the ego, because they're really reinforced by society, so it's pretty difficult to suspend those and destroy those indefinitely. But when we're in that, we can sort of harvest, practice, and body to break it down consciously, even though we're more identified with it because we're constantly having it reinforced by society. And that's what happens in map consciousness. We're in this space of identifying with attention and not actually responding as much to the structures of society. We're doing our own thing. We're doing whatever the moment demands. But that only can happen for so long. And then the process of coming back to so-called regular consciousness, that's the process that really shows us the structures. So in the higher states of map consciousness, we really see and experience and move in that other dimension and kind of learn about that. And when we're coming back to regular consciousness, we're learning about all the structures of the ego and society and what the result of that is. And it's really scary because when the brain is seeing that, it doesn't know the difference that stuff from the past, it's not really happening, but it's happening in consciousness. And the brain and body doesn't know the difference of it happening in consciousness and happening to the body. The body kind of knows, so maybe that's important to really realize that one's body is safe and keep one's body safe. And so the body knows it's kind of safe, and the consciousness can kind of do its thing and show us the movie that we need to see in order to work towards not participating in anything like that anymore, because we see how damaging and detrimental it is. And I was thinking if precognition or cognition can go to map cognition or map perception, perception of the map, or being identified with attention and attending to attention in order to make the map instead of being lost in the map, instead of being identified with the map that's already made. It's a state where we can start making a new map, and that requires map perception. And I remember reading that the brain fills in something like 50% with pattern recognition. But if that pattern recognition is recognizing the old pattern of society that we no longer want to participate, well, now we have this 50% that can actually be a creative space in the brain to fill in what we see as possible instead of the patterns that we always recognize. And when the brain is based on precognition and cognition, it's filling it in with what it recognizes, filling the pattern with what is recognized from the past. But when we're in possibility, I think this 50% opens up to that possibility. And so we have 50% more creative capacity in terms of what the brain is showing us. And we have a lot more access to energy. And I feel like mania is sort of a state of repertinization. It's making other things pertinent, other energies, other flows. And that was a lot of talking to myself, and I'm kind of surprised that I was able to kind of get into that last bit, because that was all really old stuff that I'd sort of been neglecting at the bottom of my notepad in my computer. And yet I found a lot in that, and it seemed to kind of flow. So that was good, and I'm surprised. And that kind of closes what I want to say about all that. And then I will read those documents maybe tomorrow, because now I have a lot of editing to do. But what really matters after all of this self-dialogue, I feel like, is laughter. So I hope after reading these next documents, can I laugh again? Can I create laughter? Can I have insights that create laughter? So I'm actually going to put that as a reminder in my iPhone calendar. Laughter. And maybe that's where Patch Adams comes in. Last night, I didn't sleep quite as well. I was falling asleep, and then I could hear somebody stomping around and actually making drumming sounds with their hands. And so I had to actually tell them to be quiet because it was 10:30, and that's when I was trying to fall asleep. So that was unfortunate, but that's just something that happens. And then it took me a while to fall asleep after that, maybe an hour. But I did fall asleep, which was good, and I woke up kind of early, so I might have slept 7 or 6.5 hours. It might actually be good to get one of those Fitbit things that keeps track of sleep and heart rate for my own knowledge, because these are some of the things that are actually some of the most important variables, especially now moving in life without the meds. And today I am again feeling some of that so-called anxious feeling in my heart and body. It could be my body sort of craving lithium in the morning. Like, where's the lithium? You didn't take it last night. So just wanting to move through that, and I'm drinking chamomile tea, and I had some hawthorn extract, which is good for the heart. And I'm also hoping to spend more time outside when I get this last bit of dialogue done. After the 20th, in 9 days, I want to just go down to 1 video a day and change the conversation slightly. And yesterday I got through everything I wanted to get through, and I was editing forever. I was probably working on stuff between videoing and editing and everything for 8 hours. It's probably the longest I've ever done. Perhaps one of the longest. And after editing them, I actually came up with quite a few extrapolations, and I was hoping that wouldn't happen. So I'll go through those because it's kind of more positive, and after that I want to read some of this negative-ish stuff and just put it out there and get it out there and move on. And it's actually a bit of a reminder to me about why maybe I shouldn't go back and dip my toe in the system, because something I see can create a lot of information around this stuff that I don't want to look at and I don't want to be a part of, and I could go back and try and be a part of it, or I could just read this and maybe put it out there one day and let that do the talking and move on with my life if I'm so fortunate to continue to live it. And it's also a reminder of why perhaps I can't work in peer support. Maybe I can still do other things that I've been trained to do, but we'll see. We'll see. I really want to focus on thriving and altruism. So thriving myself and using my energy to help others. And also things like oxygen and laughter and singing and dancing and oxytocin. So hopefully I can move into these as I wind this part of the dialogue down leading up to the 20th, but some of these energies might have other ideas. And a friend emailed me and asked if I was concerned about these other energies coming back and will I be able to ride it out. And I was saying, well, it's funny you asked that because I've been asking myself that same thing. Will I be able to ride it out? So I think the next part might be all positive and lovely, but it might not. There might be some real energy to ride out and really surf the wave of consciousness and maybe fall off and crash to the bottom and have to climb my way up again somehow. And I was thinking about how some of my older writing from 2 years ago that I haven't looked at, I feel like it was from a higher state of consciousness. It was more instruction to myself or writing as another entity perhaps. And I feel like the self-dialogue has a lot of old mixed in with the new, or creating context of past experience. And I wonder if one day there will be a connection with just that other voice that isn't about something, that isn't about the past, but is speaking almost from another dimension. And I don't know if that's true, but that's part of why I want to end this mental health conversation and just connect with that other voice and not talk about mental health, but just move with the process that initially was, that got translated into a mental health condition, but it's more like mental health conditioning. I was conditioned to feel like it's all mental health, illness and stuff. And I realized this next bit actually could be talking myself out of the me. So I talk myself out of the mental health system, but now I'm left with me, and I need to talk myself out of that, because the me could actually lead to destructive patterns, perhaps. So can I keep talking to myself to keep myself ahead of that me? Can I talk to myself about the altruistic projects I want to start and things like that, which are selfless, and use that to move away from this me, this self that might wish to destroy this body. And I was thinking about how I shared that guy from the colon hydrotherapy clinic said, write stuff down and look at it. Like there was some kind of witnessing element there that was helpful. And I realized that this self-dialogue, talking to myself on video, is the same. It's an equivalent process to writing stuff down and looking at it. I do write stuff down and look at it, and then I talk about it, and then I look at that, and then I just leave it alone and move on. And I was thinking about how perceptual insight is like fusion. It creates more energy and information than it takes in, or that takes to initiate that process. And in that way, it's immeasurable, because if we take any kind of measuring instrument, it's measuring something out of the whole. So a ruler measures something out of the whole, but how do you create an instrument that can measure that which is beyond the initial input in a way? And I'm sure you can, but a ruler takes a bit out of the whole, but what if something creates more? So what are those variables? Where do they come from? So I can't remember if I mentioned that the heart coherence I did yesterday, the breathing coherence, wasn't as easy. It wasn't as easy to stay in coherence as it had been. And also, when I was editing all those videos yesterday, I took 16,000 steps according to my iPhone, and I usually don't take that many steps, probably like 3,000 to 5,000. Which isn't enough for sure, but it was a cool enough day to be able to edit outside. And in terms of the dream center, I actually have this feeling that it actually will save my life in my next life. And of course I can't prove whether that's true, but what if it's possible that what we create in this life is actually what will help us in the next life or hinder us? And I talked about how a mental health diagnosis is really a consolidation of the past and trauma. And medication is a consolation prize, and so is recovery a lot of times, and the life we get to live because of that. And I was thinking about the abstractions and context I've made for myself, and they could be a safety net for looking at old energies that might arise that need processing. So the 4 episodes I've had of psychosis over the last 3 years while taking medications, they were sort of a pattern that I could get used to. And so now that I'm off meds, it could be something completely different. It might look completely different. So will the context that I've created prepare me for that and help save me through that? And it's difficult to process the old while being in touch with so much more new information. The old mixed with the new. And can I get through that old mixed with the new time and just live in the new? And this mixture state seems to be when map perception is still self-reflexive. And that makes me think that this process is impersonal. So that could be part of talking me out of the me, is that any energies that come through for processing aren't personal, even if they arise as personal experiences in the past, because that's how the me would interpret these energies, is it's something from the past, when it could just be a bunch of energy coming through, and it gets translated into the me voice because that's the language we speak inside. But to be with those energies without the words of the me, without self-reflexive action on these energies, just letting them move through and not translating them according to the me. And that could be a key. To be dispassionate and feel like it has nothing to do with me. Because we have in our orientation inside to feel like everything has everything to do with us all the time, according to how we think it does. So can I surrender that? Can I release that? And I was thinking about when I was first in map consciousness before I was labeled, and how I was losing a lot of weight. And I was thinking about how mitochondria can burn ketones, which is from fat, for energy. So I was thinking about if I was in a state that required a lot of energy, all of a sudden my body was using the fat stores for energy, and the mitochondria were able to use that for fuel. And it could have been because I was staying awake a lot, but it could also just be that high energy state. That energy had to come from somewhere. And the state of burning ketones actually helps to repair and recycle old mitochondria. So the weak ones die off and new ones come about. So I can just see a correlation with what my body was doing and just this high state of energy. So it seems like I was going into this higher state of energy. I need more and better and stronger mitochondria. So I was in ketosis, even though I wasn't just eating fat. And that process was actually changing the cellular energetics of my body. And maybe had I been able to continue through that, I would have actually have been stronger. And I remember in that process feeling very strong, like I was able to balance more, and I was more fluid, and I was just way stronger, and I was lean and quite powerful. So there was something changing in my body. I think that was a change that the universe initiated. It wasn't, because I was eating a certain way or doing something consciously to do that. And the fact that we can put ourselves into ketosis by, say, eating a high-fat, low-protein, low-carb diet, that's one thing. But the fact that we have that metabolic ability could actually have something more to do with the universe and initiating that process for some reason to make the body more able to produce energy, which it seems like it was doing because I needed energy because I was in a higher energy state. So I can see that there could be some value into me actually volitionally doing this because that's what the universe was trying to do. So this is actually in alignment with harvesting my mania, not just harvesting it intellectually or spiritually or psychologically or philosophically, but also physiologically. And it seems like my body went into ketosis and it was trying to upgrade the mitochondrial functioning to be able to burn more oxygen. And this ability to burn more oxygen could actually be important for higher states of consciousness. So I will probably do those sprints every 2 or 3 days. It's not much of anything, and I don't really exercise. So it's more about embodying one's mania. So one can exercise to burn fat or have a better body, but I feel like I want to, in order to embody my mania and get with the process that it seems like the universe was initiating, and being able to process more oxygen. And this could be part of the mutation that happens in the transformation. It's not just a mutation in the mind, but it's also a mutation in the physiological functioning of the body. And it's interesting that the medications we take actually mess up the physiological functioning of our body, so often we gain weight and are less able to move about and be active. So it goes a little bit back to that superhumanness, and do I have to be somewhat superhuman to survive this transformation, or will the transformation create me as a bit of a superhuman? And I kind of want to see that movie Wonder Woman for a little bit of inspiration. We have to be able to create and process a lot of energy. And I wonder if there's something to do with perception and the mitochondria. So by moving in perception and action, and how that creates more information and energy to act upon and move, that has some kind of mitochondrial implication. So we, as people who go into map consciousness, or so-called bipolar people, we go into these really high energy states, and we're super perceptive and have this hyper ability to perceive. And that could have something to do with the energy. That might actually create some of the energy that we have to process. So we need mitochondria in order to be able to harvest those electrons. Maybe there's electrons and energy from a different source, from perceiving light and translating that in all the ways that I've talked about with myself. So everything I've talked about with myself, but just add in the little mitochondria to the equation in terms of one of the physiological factors. So all in all, doing some sprints could actually be one of the most important things for embodying one's mania, inviting that energy back, being able to process that energy, have some capacitance for that energy, transform it, amplify it, and really create with it, instead of being creative with it and then ending up falling into the mental health system. If we never fell out of that high state of energy, whatever you want to call it, it's called mania in a more pathological connotation, in that the aftermath of that is bad. But what if there was no aftermath? So the medications could actually block some kind of mitochondrial energetic processes. And even this so-called anxiety I'm feeling could have something to do with mitochondria changing their energetics, and it's slightly uncomfortable to the body, just like having your tooth pulled or something, but it's something that needs to be done. We cannot hold meaning in our hand, but we can apprehend it, and it moves us. And in that way, it's part of the manifest. And I feel like the other dimension has a different field of gravity, and our mass is lighter. Or it's just that we are aligned in gravity. When our physiology is in alignment with gravity, we feel lighter. So the subjective experience of gravity is different. So perhaps only our personal subjectivity makes us different, our unique center of gravity. And I feel like when we're in that non-linear consciousness, we have access to the past more readily because it's a non-linear state. Plus, we're able to access information faster, so that's how our consciousness can really travel forward or backwards so quickly. And getting used to that shift and that flux and surrendering to it might be really important. But again, who's going to surrender? It's more about attending to attention and attending to the witness. And maybe we can only stay ahead of this past by creating. If the brain is being utilized for this creative capacity that it's meant and designed for, then maybe it doesn't go back to this sort of habitual state of accessing the past, which could actually just be a provocation to get more creative. So if we're not being creative and creating, the brain just recreates the past by recalling things. And one of my favorite books that I ever read was The Politics of Experience, and I think it's by R.D. Laing, and it's quite genius, everything in that book. And I think part of this is actually creating one's own experience politics. Creating one's own context is like creating one's own inner politics and governance, and writing the laws and rules of the inner dimension, which is actually a lot different than the ones that we usually experience on a day-to-day basis. Those are conditioned into us, but we can experience things differently, which is part of the deconditioning, but then actually understand some of these other inner politics that are more real and natural, which can actually be quite uncomfortable in the transition, and they could also change day by day. So part of it is being able to see new applications of it and change and be very fluid. And I was wondering about how sometimes when we're in distress and we're sort of bouncing around looking for some kind of altruistic support, some kind of selfless support without motive and without pushing us in a certain way, when we don't have that altruistic support and we know it, we feel it subconsciously, it could be one of the ways that the brain switches into a state of altruism, which I feel is part of the value system of bipolar. Even when that omnipolar consciousness is mixed in with ego elements, there is still this element that awakens that realizes we're all one, it's all one thing. And so if it is, there's just naturally altruism. So when we don't have that support and we're kind of down in the dumps, the brain can actually create its own altruism for itself and others and survive that way for at least a period of time. So in a way we become the savior and the saved. And it's partially because we realize that nobody cares in the moment. And I was thinking about the word thinking, and you can separate it out into thing and king. So things are king, and that's sort of like saying we value things and we value thinking. So, and thinking creates things by labeling them. So I wonder if we can say something like energizing instead of saying I'm thinking, which has obvious connotations, valuing thinking and opinions, and also separating things out into things and separating those things from ourselves and thinking that that is of the utmost value. And it's also thinking that us as a thing is king and what we think is king. So I wonder if we can say I'm energizing. I'm energizing that I like dogs or something. So it actually has a different element. There's no separate energy. So if we're energizing something, we realize in a way implicitly that it's connected to other things. And we realize that we are creating that energy. It's not like this passive thing like my thoughts. It's this energy. And what is that energy going to do? And it implies related energies. And it also doesn't sound like my thinking versus your thinking. It's something that I'm energizing, and that is something I want, and someone could participate with that or not. It doesn't have to be a battle. And also we're energy, and if we're energizing, it's actually more in alignment with what we actually are and what we're doing and what the process actually is and does, as opposed to saying I'm thinking, when we're not just thoughts. And when we say I'm thinking, we identify with our thoughts and being our thoughts, when maybe we can identify with what we energize, and that could bring some more sanity to it. Or we could say I'm energy queen, and I'm just being silly because go from king to queen, even though that kind of word is an ing word, but maybe we can change it to EEN or something like energine or energy queen. So that means that there's some feminine energy in there instead of the word king or the sound king. We are energy transforming itself. We're energy energizing itself. So if we say, I'm energizing, and it also has a nice connotation in energy, the word energizing itself. We're energy creating itself. There's this fusion. Perception is fusion and order, and could using the word energizing actually create more sanity in perception, in that it's something that we're bringing into awareness and energizing, but it's not this thing. It's not this separate existence. And we're not a separate existence, creating more separation through our use of language. So I wonder if there is a field of language energetics and speaking as perception, or changing words to be in more alignment with perception and how we actually perceive, and not in alignment with thinking. And can we make the energy created by perception synergistic, and can we do this with language? And if we don't make it synergistic, we sort of pinch off into a separate reality, and that's what we do by the way we speak. And the thing about the word energize too, if I say I energize or I'm energizing, it's the energy in our eyes, the energy we create by what we see, and not just by what we think, because what we think is generally in terms of conflict, and when we say our thoughts, it's generally conflicting with other people. And Krishnamurti talks about thinking together. Well, can we energize together? Can we see something together and create energy by looking with our eyes, and then giving voice to that, which is energy creating language, which could be language energetics. So I've talked about epigenetics, epimimetics, endomimetics, epimimetics, whatever. Maybe there's language energetics or something to do with that. Changing the energy behind language to create more unity in our perceptions and ways of speaking and communicating. And I was thinking about how map consciousness, going into that altered state of trans consciousness or omnipolarity, is actually like a commercial break from this reality. It's a commercial in this show of reality that we're watching. It's kind of like an advertisement for another world. And just with advertising in this world, they're hoping that with their little ways of using images and words and sounds and music, that will take up a place in our brain. So when we think to go buy something, we'll buy that brand, or we'll do that thing, or we'll have that experience. And so in the same way, this map consciousness experience is like this commercial break, and we're living in that for a while, and it changes certain parts in our brain, so we can actually see those aspects of reality when we're moving through the so-called consensus world. And when we see those bits, we'll subconsciously move towards some of it. But I think that is actually interrupted, that process of seeing the commercial break of map consciousness, and then again regaining egocentric, me-centric consciousness, and then taking meds actually blocks this natural wave movement of sort of breaking some of the ego structures during that commercial break. It's like an ego break, and then we go back into the ego reality, and that commercial break helps to make salient some bits for later, or make us understand more. So if I see a commercial on TV for some kind of experience, and then I go experience it, I will actually remember what it's about, or I know kind of what it's about from the commercial. So in the same way, if I experience the commercial break of reality, the ego break of map consciousness, it's kind of a little bit of a introduction to that state of consciousness, if it does come back as an experience again, and it's easier to navigate. And my brain has been thinking a little bit more about word transformations, and I was thinking about tender consciousness, which could be seen as tend her consciousness, which could be seen as the female energy. So can we have tender consciousness? And it seems like the pathology is really in language, as it affects the way we see and it affects the way we experience ourselves. So this is where that language energetics could be important. And through the self-dialogue, can I speak with myself in some of these ways that I've experimented with, though I don't really remember most of them, but can I apply that to harvesting my map consciousness and get the languaging in alignment, the use of language and the words in alignment with that state? I remember when I had my bad psych ward experience last year, when people came to visit me, every single word sounded like nails on a chalkboard. It just sounded so, ugh. So I think there's something to that. And the way we use language and the words we use affects what we see as. So we're seeing as the me, but we can see as this energy that witnesses itself. As this energy that witnesses itself unfolding. And it's not just words, but it's how words participate with seeing and word perception. And I talked a lot about that, how words, sound, image, light actually interferes with the pure energy coming in of perception. And that sound, image, and light actually narrows our vision down to like a pinhole point on the whole field of perception. And so we can't actually receive the whole impression and have a different algorithm calculate what is most necessary to arise in consciousness for us then to give voice to or not. It's interesting how after half an hour of talking to myself, I don't feel any anxiety. And maybe it's because I took that hawthorn, and then I did take some amino acids, regular scheduled dose, as well as regular scheduled dose of hearty nutritionals. And I actually took 5 instead of 4 for my second dose of the day, just because I have this extra energy circulating and I feel like it could use some nutritional support. Or it could just be talking to myself, and I had something come to mind that perception doesn't have anxiety. So perception and action doesn't have anxiety. And anxiety is some kind of inaction from the past that's sort of built up, that we've carried forward to the present moment. So can that subside through perception and action, and in talking to oneself in a different way in self-dialogue? I don't know. Maybe I'll have some new insights into this through talking myself out of the me. And I remember reading once that if you don't create your own system, you'll end up living according to other people's systems. Something like that. So for example, if I don't create a business or something, I'm going to live working for someone else and living in that systemic structure of whatever they've created. And I think that's similar for talking oneself out of the mental health system. I was living according to that system, but in creating other context, I was able to talk myself out of that, and then what can I design through my own language energetics moving forward? And I was thinking about how if addiction is a brain disease, then society is the cause of it. And I feel like by saying it's a mental illness, it's like saying, sorry, we don't have time to listen to you, so take this pill, and you won't feel like saying much anymore, and you'll probably forget what you wanted to say. And I was thinking about how a teacher in high school once told me that we learn best by teaching. So after she would teach us something, she would get us to teach that to the person beside us. And I was thinking about how teaching is kind of like sharing and getting a response. So can we learn by sharing? Because sharing in a way is teaching, because we teach what we share. And I was thinking about how I'm harvesting my map consciousness experience after the fact. And those experiences are still with me, just like past memories. So it's still the past. And life isn't memories, and life isn't in these memories, even if they are these altered states experiences. But instead of using past thoughts as a map, it's using some of these past altered states as a map. But I still feel like that's still not entering the moment. I still haven't entered the moment, and I don't feel like that'll happen until that mixture of the me is gone, and even the recollections of the past map consciousness experiences. And yesterday when I was out for a walk, I was walking and moving, and I was noticing everything move. And I was seeing that as I was holding this framework of movement instead of time, everything felt a little bit different. And in the state of map consciousness, I've had the experience where I can't keep track of time. And I feel like this whole concept or sensation of movement becomes more primary than actual time. So there's this time ticking by on a clock, but when we're with movement, it adds a whole different dimensionality to the passage of time. When we feel it as all of this different movement within us and around us, and in reference to us and relative to us. And I wonder if there's some energy that leads to eternity and sort of buys time and transcends time. And is that something to do with moving one's identification to sensing movement instead of time? Or maybe not instead, but in favor of. And I was also energizing that meaning changes our perception of time. So if we were in contact with infinite meaning, we might actually be in contact with eternity. What are the eternal meanings of eternity? And we need to be able to read the space of map consciousness, which has more to do with this movement than time. If we're putting our senses on this whole movement of reality in the world and the cosmos, and not so much on time, as in clock time or time as the past, then we're moving in a different dimension. And we're learning how to read that dimension and speak as that dimension and be that dimension and write as that dimension. And it seems that those of us that see that dimension, see it for ourselves, are called crazy. And those who just believe and repeat are called sane. So it seems that parrots don't get pathologized. And can there be a moment-to-moment seeing and understanding? There's no time for beliefs, as beliefs are time. And I talked about wondering if I can really invite that voice, or that energy that gives voice to that other dimension, to really come in and take over. If I can see movement instead of time, it's eternity. What if we become blind to time? To the past, to the future, especially psychologically. And it seems like it's no wonder in map consciousness we can't keep track of time, because we're tracking something else. We're tracking a movement of meaning and beauty. So it seems like meaning and beauty and the perception of that give a different sense orientation of time and space and movement and all of that, and even the laws of physics and gravity. I have a feeling that we would cooperate if our language didn't create the division between thinker and thought. Why does this energy that arises, that we energize, get split into thinker and thought? And that split causes identification by virtue of the split. But there's neither an identifier or something to identify with. And in all my conversation with myself, I'm still not against the system. I don't like that there's no real paths out of it and support to get out of it if one wants to. And I feel like in map consciousness, and if we can become omnipolar and transconscious, the brain becomes an amplifier instead of a limiter. And we need some brains to become amplifiers because there's too many brains out there that are limiters. And this will consume the earth. So it seems to be creating new functionality and a new neurotribe to bring some kind of balance. So this is my 300th video for real. I did a 300th video on the 7th as one anniversary, but this is more of a real anniversary. 300 videos that I've edited talking to myself in the last year, under a year, because June 20th was the start of that. And it's been a very interesting journey. And I was just editing the last video I made, and I ended up with a bunch more extrapolations. So I will talk to myself for my 300th video, do some extrapolations, and then next video I want to share some things that I wrote while working in the mental health system, and that'll probably be 2 videos, and then hopefully it will be moving on from some of that. And maybe I'll also put a video of me in psychosis in the mix, just to share some of that past context. And that video really shows that what one is embodying is what is being given voice to. So I was embodying being a homeless person, and I sure felt like one, and I was scared and cold and terrified, and that's how I was speaking, and it was very scary. So opposite of that, I'm moving towards hopefully embodying something else, and that's why I would like to leave behind this conversation about mental health. And maybe I won't, I would like to, but I feel like if I put these last bits of the puzzle together, that will invite more of a different type of conversation, possibly. But first, let's celebrate. I made this silly video in June of last year, and I haven't included it in anything yet, so why not just include it in the celebration of 300 videos? it seems like a year ago I was celebrating my victory before the victory even came about. So no time to waste, on to extrapolations. No need to get lost in the 300 video marker. My next marker is 365 videos by September 11th, and I'm hoping that the next set of videos after June 20th will be somewhat different. And I just realized that I can get an Apple Watch, and that would keep track of my heart rate, and it's only maybe twice the price of a Fitbit, but a Fitbit doesn't really do as much as an Apple Watch. So I think for twice the price, it has way more than twice the application and value. And also, I remember when I was trying to design safety in my life, just having the ability to text, always having that functionality on one's body is good as a person who goes into altered states of consciousness. So having those functions, because I think it's important. And I can't remember if I said in my last video, would we cooperate if our language didn't create the division between thinker and the thought? I think I did say that. Edit that out. And I might have been talking about the brain as an amplifier. And Gaia needs brains as amplifiers because there's too many brains that are acting as limiters of energy and consciousness. And this function of the brain will consume the earth, so it needs this amplification. And the brain actually needs to amplify energy in order to be sensitive enough to give voice to Gaia, to give voice to the perceptions of a clear human brain, a brain that's not clogged up by thoughts of the me, which is just a mirage of the meanings that have coalesced together to create this separation of me. So the amplification is to balance brain function and create a new neurotribe. So we can actually hear Gaia speak through ourselves by having clear perception. So having clarity of perception is important to be able to see what Gaia is saying and give voice to that. And map consciousness is sort of an anti-entropic property of the brain. So the ego consciousness is creating too much entropy in Gaia. It's creating too much breaking apart of the indivisible interconnectedness of Gaia. And the ego comes in and chops it up for its own meanings and uses. So map consciousness is sort of the perception that is going to steward this movement of unity that will allow Gaia to heal. And meaning, a lot of meaning can be extracted from a very small perception, when usually our large perceptual field is limited by past meanings of the ego, which are meaningless in the moment. And can we go from using our brain to remember to a function of transmembering? Can the brain be a member of translation instead of repetition, regurgitation, and can it be an ampli member? Can it amplify? So instead of speaking in terms of I remember this and I remember that, can we say I amply member this and I transmember that? Meaning we're using our brain for something totally different than recalling the past. It could be related to actually translating something we see. So if I have an insight or a perception, I could say I transmember or I amply member, which actually indicates that I'm seeing something in the moment and amplifying it and translating it into words, into human experience, into human perceptions, but it's not meeting the moment with past memories and then saying the memory in response to seeing a moment. So we're not being reminded of something, but we're actually amplifying something. And I'm seeing now that since we meet the moment with our memories, if we see something in the moment that we perceive, we don't generally talk about that perception, we actually talk about the associated past memory. And I'm seeing now that it's mainly because we don't speak the language of the moment. We speak the language of the past and we speak the language of the me. So we recall our me memories and then relate that story, as opposed to being vulnerable with our perception of something that we're able to extrapolate from the pattern of the moment. And I think that's what's happening when we go into map consciousness, so-called bipolar or omnipolar or trans consciousness, is we start to speak in a different way. We're actually speaking what we see in the moment, and sometimes that gets mixed in with past associations because we still speak that language in our brain, but it's an attempt to move towards harvesting the perception of the moment and speaking as that instead of having some kind of perception-like experience, but the association comes in so fast that we share that story. We don't share this transmembering thing. We're not this membrane of translating this moment that we're in contact with. We're using our brain to recall past memories and share those. We're not able to actually share the moment. We're sharing our past. So that's something new. I've never quite seen it like that, and seen it as we're already kind of doing this, but we're usually recalling our past and associating. We're not willing to not know. We're not willing to let go of what we know and what we're recalling to really see the moment and see what that gives voice to, because it's always giving voice to the past associations related to the moment. And if we're able to drop that, then we're open to a wider array of what we can see, because we're not always trying to see our past memories and pick out the bits related to our past memories. We're able to pick out a lot more bits, and that could be what is actually loosening hold when we're able to perceive way more and access more information when we go into map consciousness and trans consciousness. And that's again related to how we always relate everything to the me, to the story of the me, to what the me knows, which is very small. And today I met this man named Donald DeSimone, and he wrote this book, Bouncing Back with Momentum. And I haven't read much of it, just the first chapter so far. But I like how he says human beings can bounce back even with momentum. Whereas if we drop a ball on the ground, it's not going to gain momentum. It's going to only bounce up lower than it was originally dropped. And with humans, it's different. If we're dropped to the lowest of the low through the process of the mental health system, we can actually bounce back higher. And can we get the momentum of the universe on our side? And at the end of chapter 1, he asks a few questions. And one that I like is, can others improve their life by using your ideas? And it's talking about making a difference in one's life and in the lives of others. And I sure hope that at least one person might benefit from one of my ideas. That's kind of part of the point of this. It's nice that doing this is actually helping me move forward. And hopefully at some point I will feel forward enough to move this out to others. And hopefully others might benefit from some of these ideas. And what can you suggest to others? I don't know. I've made a lot of suggestions to myself, just to myself, not suggesting to others. I don't know if I want to make any suggestions to others per se, because I've maybe created thousands of ideas, and to say I suggest one thing actually shows that I'm lacking insight and perception, because insight and perception is infinite. And if I'm able to create thousands of ideas, how can I say which person needs which one and who needs what? And probably nobody needs any of it, but it's just part of what is a capacity of being a human being. And for me, it's more showing a potentiality of a brain that's been diagnosed with bipolar, a brain that's said to be defective, deficient, unhealthy, unwell, and maybe breaking through some of that, hopefully, at least part of the time. And maybe then awakening some possibilities for other people, and it's the possibility that will create for others, not any particular suggestions. It's opening the brain to possibility again, because our brains were open to possibility. So I'm not suggesting anything that anyone who's kind of like me might have not already been in contact with. I'm just making it more into some kind of illustration by putting it on video. My only suggestion would be see for yourself, and don't believe anything anyone says, not me, not even yourself, after you finish uttering the words. Because that's the only thing that leaves space open for the next perception. So to have a couple perceptions, a couple tips, and then say, these are my tips, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's hanging on to something. And the whole process of bipolar is we can't hang on to anything. Nothing's guaranteed, not even the structure of the ego me. So to form some of those structures and attach them to the ego me and then go around sharing them is missing the point. The point is there is no point. There's no point where this ends. It just keeps going, keep moving. So I might read more of that book because it seems interesting. Interesting timing. And the way he explained the book to me was quite nice as well. It was something to do with creating meaning and blah, 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 and something related to what I seem to already be doing with myself. Did I contribute to how people who are labeled make understanding and make meaning for themselves? And by believing everything that's told to us in the mental health system, we're not making meaning and understanding for ourselves. We're trying to understand what we're being told to believe. And a lot of times there's some helpful stuff there, but there's also things that don't resonate with our experience. So if we can make meaning based on that, it could provide a wider, more meaningful container through which to move through some of these experiences. And again, not telling anyone how to understand oneself. There is no how anyway. There's understanding moment to moment. It's not a how. And I came up with something related to that when I was extrapolating my last video, which was, who is a set of meanings? The meanings as in MEANINGS. Sometimes when you split up words in weird ways, it makes more sense in terms of thinking in this way. So the meanings create a mirage of the who. The circular meanings related to separating oneself from reality create this mirage of a who. And it seems like some other similar structure, and it could be the meanings of the ego too, create a mirage of the how. So only by abstracting and separating ourselves from reality do we sort of abstract a how, instead of observation and moving step by step with the moment without abstraction. So abstraction creates the how and the who. So that which seems to abstract is actually an abstraction. So the me, the ego, the who, seems to be the one thing that's abstracting, but the abstraction creates the separation. So when it creates that separation, it invariably creates sort of a subject and an object, but it's just a split of the abstraction process by abstracting reality. If the brain is creating and moving with the moment, perception and action in each moment, it doesn't abstract the me separate from the moment asking how. So when the me comes in, it means we're not creating, we're not in creation. We're not part of creation. We've abstracted and thus created this perspective of being separate and then asking how as a who asking how. And really this is understanding eternity, where there's no time, there's no me separate from everything else. All is just eternally one. So in this process, in this state, the brain can amplify information and unfold information. And the information is folded up in reality, the information and energy, kind of like origami. And even when you think about DNA, it's folded up and coiled and curled, and all that information is folded, and it only actually becomes available when it's unpacked, when there's a signal to transcribe it in some way. And that signal is something that has to have some kind of perceptual input. The cell has to perceive the signal, and that perception has to be passed on, and then the information can be unfolded and create a structure to actually move based on that perception. So perceiving reality is like reverse origami. It's unfolding and accessing the information that's all coiled up. And it could be coiled up in the moment, kind of like it's coiled up in the DNA. And I think right now Gaia is sending the signaling molecules to our perceptual apparatus, our eyes, all of our sense organs, to send the signal to unfold certain information in our own physiology, but it's also the information unfolding in reality and being made available to us to amplify and translate. We are decoders of Gaia, and the Gaia code is folded up in the brain. But Gaia is sending us signals now so that we can decode this and then change our bodily DNA. If our body was just one piece of DNA, it would change shape and decode different messages and behave differently and create something in response to this message. So it's obviously up to us.